Hi guys, this is Chapter 12, Lesson 2 on histograms. You're going to need your math book open to pages 871 through 874, a pencil and a pen, and a reminder that you need to be neat, copy everything, and of course make any corrections that you need to make. So we're going to start with talking about two things that we're going to do in this section. We're going to be interpreting data from an actual histogram, and we're also going to be constructing a histogram, which is the same thing as saying we're going to be making a histogram. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the real world link. So it says here, Alicia researched the average price of concert tickets. The table shows the results. So here you can see the average price of concert tickets right over there. Then it says fill in the tally column and frequency column on the frequency table. So what I would like for you guys to do is in a moment I would like for you to pause the video and I want you to tally up where each of those prices fall in between the ranges, or the intervals is what we're calling them, over in this area. So for instance, the first price is $83.87. That's obviously going to fall into that last interval, and you're going to go ahead and use a tally mark. So go ahead and pause now. All right, so you can see what I did here is I did my tally marks. Now my frequency is how many. So you can see that I went ahead and used actual numbers in the frequency part. So prices between $25 and $49.99 was 1. The number of concert tickets between $50 and $74.99 were 7. And the number of concert tickets between $75 and $99.99 were 2. So it says, what does each tally mark represent? Now remember, don't tell me the prices. They represent basically what each one tally mark represents one concert. What is one advantage of using frequency tables? Well, to me, I think it makes it easier to read the data and to figure out like how many in each range that you actually have. So you can quickly and easily tell how many concert tickets or how many concerts had an average ticket price of, let's say, $50 or between $50 and $74.99. And then the last one is, what is one advantage of using the first table? Now, the first table is this one right up here that I just circled. This is the first table, which is our data table. And one advantage of that is, obviously, the prices that are listed in there are much more specific. So if you want more specific information, then you do not want to use the frequency table that we used in the middle. All right. So now we're going to talk about what exactly a histogram is. You can see an example that's listed here. So the first thing that you're going to notice is that it is a type of bar graph. And what it does is it uses numerical data, that's numbers on there, not words, but numbers to organize information or data into equal intervals. So over on the left-hand side, we're going to go ahead and just highlight exactly what a histogram is. So it's a type of bar graph. And data is organized in equal intervals. Now, the intervals are these guys right over here. So you've got intervals between $25 and $49.99. That's an interval there. Here's another interval here between $50 and $74.99, and so forth. So when we're saying equal intervals, in between each of these intervals here, let's say $25 all the way to $49.99, you have an interval of $24.99. That's how many dollars or cents or numbers are in between the 25, which is the start, and the $49.99. So you want to make sure that your intervals are even. So, and the same thing goes with these guys up here. Notice how they're skip counting by twos: 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. Those are equal intervals. You would not want to do something like 0, 2, 4, and then start saying 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Because at the beginning you're skipping by twos, but then you're counting by ones. So you want to make sure you are keeping equal intervals. Okay, so the intervals allow you to see frequency distribution. Now, frequency is how many. So frequency distribution of the data tells you how many pieces of data are in each interval. So it makes it kind of easy. And these are a lot simpler than the box plots that we have already talked about in class. So let's go ahead and look at this first part here. So we have to use the same table, so that's why I kept the table on the screen. Number 1 says refer to the histogram above. what it wants us to do is to describe the histogram and then also to tell how many control airplanes cost at least $100. All right, so we're going to talk about the describing part first. Now, this is one thing that I know is difficult for you guys to know like exactly what to talk about. So first things first, tell me how many or how much data you have total. Okay, so how many, in this case, how many different prices of remote controls do you have? So always tell how many prices there are. Now I put a little squiggly underneath the word prices because this one happens to talk about prices, but in future histograms, they might not be talking about prices, okay? So you'll see here that what they started with in our explanation, it says right here that there are 9 plus 7 plus 1 plus 2 plus 1 or 20 prices in dollars recorded. Now, you do not have to sit there and list this part right here, but I would simply say there's $20 or 20 prices recorded in dollars. Now, the way they got that is if you look at your bar graph, this first one in the first interval, is 9, so you can see where it ends there. The next one is 7, and then you've got your 1, your 2, then a 0, but then you also have your 1. So that's how they ended up getting the 20 prices when you add up those numbers all together. So the next thing is tell which one has the most, and then tell which one has the least, if any, okay, or none. So here you can sit there and say, well, the one that has the most, so you can say that the most common cost of different remote control airplanes is somewhere between $25 and $49.99 because that's where it has most of their prices. You could also talk about this one right here where it has none. Simply say that, you know, no remote control airplanes cost between $125 and $149.99. Okay. You could also say, and they didn't put this in our explanation here, but you could also chunk this also, as well, saying, looking at the overall histogram, the majority of prices will fall somewhere between $25 and $74.99, because notice how most of those prices, the 9 and the 7, are really there. And then, of course, you're going to get a few control airplanes that are obviously going to cost more, and even beyond this graph as well. So in the second part of the question asks, how many remote control airplanes cost at least $100? All right, so this is important that you guys understand how to interpret this. Now, it's not saying how many cost exactly $100. It's saying how many cost at least $100. So when you're looking at your graph here, this is where the $100 range starts right here. So you want to look at the information that's all over in this area here. So we've got 2 planes that cost between $100 and $124.99, and you've got 0 in this column, but then you've got 1 right here. 2 plus 1 gives you 3, and that's why you can say that there are 3 remote control airplanes that have prices that are at least $100. Okay, now it's your turn. So what you're going to do here is you're going to refer to the same histogram that we've been looking at, and you're going to tell how many remote control airplanes cost less than $75. Pretty basic. Now, our keyword is less than $75. So go ahead and take a moment to do that. Pause if you need to. All right, so we already determined that in the first box, the first bar, we have 9 planes, and in the second bar graph, we have 7. So if you're going to add 9 plus 7, how many airplanes cost less than $75? That would be a total of 16 airplanes. You do not want to include information from this one right here that I just circled because it says less than and not 75 or less. So there is a difference there, so always pay attention to exactly how everything is worded. All right, so going on to example 2. Now we're going to actually be making or constructing a histogram. So the first thing that you're going to do, it says here, the table shows the number of daily visitors to selected state parks. Draw a histogram to represent the data. So the first thing you need to do is when you have your data here that I'm putting a box around, you need to organize that into a tally and frequency table, just like we did on the very first start of our lesson. So you're going to start by making a frequency table. So there's our steps, step 1. So in step 2, what you're going to do is, well, let me go back to step 1 first of all. So you always want to look to see what your smallest number is and what your highest number is. You'll notice that all our data, the smallest number that we have according to our data table, which is this guy right here, is 108, and that the largest number that we have looks like is 382. So you need to set up your frequencies now. So you don't want to sit there and do intervals of 10. If you do intervals of 10, you're going to have a very, very long frequency table and a very long histogram. So you want to break them up into kind of bigger chunks. So what they did here is they broke these through an interval of 50. Okay, so from 100 to 145, that is actually 50 because you're including 100 plus 49 more. Okay, so they broke them up into intervals of 50. So you can see how they broke them up here. So this is going to be basically the hardest part, is to figure out how you're going to break up your intervals. You don't want to sit there and do them into chunks of 100, because then that information's too broad. It's not going to be specific enough here. So, but you want to make sure that your intervals that you're choosing makes your information or your data easy to compare, okay? So once you've determined your intervals, here they did in intervals of 50, they went ahead and did their tally marks, and then they counted up our tally marks and put in our frequency stuff, or frequency numbers. So now we're going to be on step 2. It says to draw and label a horizontal and vertical axis. All right, so when you're going to be doing these right here, so basically what I tend to like to start with is by drawing my vertical and my horizontal axis. So I kind of start with doing that first, because and don't box it off first, because you might realize that, hey, the numbers that you're doing might require more room. So if I do this and I need more room, then I have to do a lot of erasing. So I kind of leave it open at first. So it does say to label. You guys, this is super important, and this is one thing I did not emphasize in class today, or the first day, but you want to make sure you definitely have a label, a title to your graph. That title can be the same one that's right up here in your tally table, or the same one that you got from your data table up here, daily visitors to selected state parks. And you need to label your 2 axes. So the one going up and down, your vertical one, is always going to be your frequency, that is how many. And then your number of visitors is going to be your horizontal. That's the one where you're going to have your intervals listed. All right, so let me clean off my graph a little bit here. All right, so now your frequencies, which is the 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, I determine that based on this information here. You definitely want to have a 0. The 0 is going to be at the very bottom, and then just go high enough that you could include the most number, which happens to be 8. So you see that. So on this one, they went one higher, they went up to 10, so that's always nice just to go one notch higher. But you don't want to sit there and have this extra tall graph that goes up to, let's say, 15 or 20 when your biggest frequency is 8. It's unnecessary, and it actually skews your data. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in a future lesson. Okay, so now that we have that, you're going to go ahead and put your intervals. Now these intervals here are the same ones that you chose over in your frequency table. So if you took the time to do it in there, you have to use the same exact ones. Now when you're making these, be very neat. You also want to make sure that you're leaving enough space in between them right over here so that your data is not super duper crammed together down at the bottom, so it's easily read, I should say. All right, so then the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to start graphing now. So now we're looking at step 3. For each interval, draw a bar whose height is given by the frequencies. So we're going to look at our frequency table and look at our visitors between 100 and 149. We said that there were 2. So on your bar graph here, or your histogram, which remember is a bar graph. I'm going to go ahead and choose a different color here. Let's do green. All right, so we have 2 people in that area there. So I'm going to go ahead and do a bar, which is like a rectangle. All right, and then you could also fill it in, color it in if you want to. Oh, that's a different green, but you get I can't do this using a stylus. But you guys kind of get the idea, and I'll go back and fill it in a bit. So then our next one is between 150 and 199, and that was 7. So you're going to find where your 7 is, which is about, wrong one, where it's about right over here, and go down. And actually, you want to make sure that these guys touch. So let me make sure my things touch. And I'm going to have to move that guy over a little bit. There we go. So you kind of want to make sure that they sort of touch like in our example there. And then the highest frequency is 8, between 200 and 249. So I think at this point you guys kind of get the idea here. And I want to make sure they touch. So when I go to color my boxes in, I'm going to definitely make sure that they touch here. So when I color them in, I can go ahead and just shade them in like this. So what I would do is when you're shading these in, especially if you're using the same exact color, I might leave my boxes open like what I had before, especially when you're using your pencils, because you don't want to sit there and just have one blob of messy to it or whatever. If you do shade in, go ahead and maybe like outline your box in a darker color, like heavy pencil, and then shade in very lightly in there. And if you're not sure of what I'm talking about, put a little question, ask Miss Paluca about the shading off to the side, and then when we bring it up in class, you could ask me then. Okay, so you would basically keep going, and then your bar graph's going to end up looking like this guy down over here. And that's really basically it. So it's not very difficult, and they're relatively easy to interpret. But once again, the hardest part will be to figure out your intervals. All right, so now it's your turn. So you're going to do everything that we just talked about and create your own histogram, including putting your own numbers. So go ahead and pause the video now and set up your intervals. Now they kind of gave you a little easy thing here. They obviously only want you to have 1, 2, 3, 4 intervals. So look at your data here and figure out how you're going to break those numbers into chunks of 4. Remember, it has to be even intervals. All right, guys, pause your video now. Okay, so I looked to find what my smallest value was for test scores, and it happened to be a 65, and my highest was a 98, I believe. Okay, so I figured since they gave me 4 intervals, so I figured 60 to about 100, that would be increments of 10. So I went ahead and did my intervals from 60 to 69, 70 to 79, 80 to 89, and 90 to 99. So remember, your intervals have to be even, and so you have to be able to include the smallest number and the biggest number in there. So I went ahead and did my tallies and then figured out my frequency. So you can see how my numbers are that are 2, 5, 10, and 11. All right, so now we're going to go to our graph. So on our graph, the first thing I did was I went ahead and put my number of students, which was my frequency. So that's my y-axis first, so it's my up and down axis. And I went ahead and started at 0 and went all the way up to 10. And I could have written a 12 at the top as well if I wanted to. Then I used my frequencies, my intervals, excuse me, to go across the bottom. So I used the same intervals, 60 to 69, 70 to 79, 80 to 89, 90 to 99. And I went ahead and made my bar graphs using the information from my frequency table. So you can see what I did here. Now, remember earlier I had said about just leaving them open, especially if you're going to be coloring them in. You don't want this big blob. So I'm okay with you leaving it like this. I've had, people in the past where they would just, go through and just do like little lines like this instead of shading everything in, so you can go and do something along those lines. But if you do something like this, make sure you're neat about it. What I don't want to see is scribbles and have people come in with things that are looking like this, because that just looks messy, and I would rather you just do nothing and leave it exactly the way you see it now than to scribble things up. Okay, now, and that's it. That was a quick lesson compared to the other ones. What you're going to do now is go ahead and do the guided practice question, and I would like for you to do just question number 1 is all that you need to do. Now, number 1 has 3 parts, A, B, and C, so be sure to include all 3 parts. All right, you guys, that's it for now, and we'll see you back in class.